to questions. And even though we've already been talking about questions, haven't we? What questions do you ask about those representations and questions to help students make those connections? And we're going to, like I said, go for a little bit and then we'll take an official break and come back and do some more with questions. But to get us into this, the teaching practice in and of itself says that we should use purposeful questions to assess and advance student reasoning. And that's actually Peg Smith's language. And at first I didn't think a lot of it, and then I started hanging around Peg Smith a lot, and I was like, oh my goodness, she is very purposeful about those two words. That assess and advance are things that we should work on and be able to use questions for both of those two purposes. So hopefully in this kind of next hour, you'll leave having a better sense of what does it mean to assess and use assessing questions versus advancing questions. But in addition to that, this is from page 36 in Principles to Action. We know merely asking questions is not enough. But in Principles to Action, we highlight two critical issues. One, thinking about the types of questions that teachers ask. And we've kind of been doing this for a while. We all know Bloom, and now Iowa's a DOK state, right? That's in all your standards in DOK. And the rigor matrix. But this other one, too, about the patterns of questioning. So we're going to kind of get into the types of questions first, and then after break, we'll make sure we get to thinking about these interaction patterns of questioning. So that's really our professional learning goal for this next hour, is to what distinguishes questions that assess versus advance, and then what's the impact of those different interaction patterns of questioning, all right? So we're going to start with types of questions. And in Principles to Action, we identified 4 types of questions. And if you want it from the book, so handout is page 9, and the book is page 36 to 37, depending where you would prefer to look at it. So as we think about these 4 types of questions, so there are a lot of questioning frameworks out there. And as the authors of Principles to Action, we looked at all these different frameworks and we said, you know what? We think we can simplify it a little bit, and there's really 4 main types. You know, we ask questions to gather information. For example, what does multiplication mean? What does subtraction mean, right? I just want to see what information or what students might recall, what they might say. Of course, the number one answer I get when I say, what does multiplication mean? They say, times, right? And when I get that, that's given me a bit of information, and then I can do something with that bit of information. Or I get those kids that say, oh, it means you're putting things in groups and wanting to find the whole amount. And I'm like, you know, so gathering information. Probing thinking is one we might ask students, oh, I see you got the answer of 28 for 4 times 7. Where did that 28 come from? Can you tell me how you got that 28? I might probe in because I see something, but I'm not quite sure what the student thinking is that led to that. Like that number 10 in that Cole's paper. What led to that 10? What led to that 28? So I, as the teacher, need that information that I want to find out what the kid is thinking. So that's where I'm going to probe. But now these other 2 categories, making the math visible, which is my favorite, and then encouraging reflection and justification. All right. So if I'm thinking about making the math visible, I kind of go back to those representations again. And I might ask a child, oh, so you know the answer is 28 to 4 times 7. Can you tell me, how about 2 places in your life where you might multiply 4 times 7? Now all of a sudden, I raised the stakes a little bit here and said, tell me more about the mathematical connections around 4 times 7. So I'm taking something, and I'm maybe taking something the student hadn't really been thinking about, and I'm making it visible, and I'm making it something that we want to talk about, okay? And then the encourage reflection and justification is probably a bit more obvious. That's where we do a lot of the whys, right? But I could think of an example for multiplication. I might say to a student, So you double the known fact. 2 times 7 is 14, you double it, you get 28. So, wow, that's a strategy you can solve multiplication problems. Can you tell me 2 other multiplication problems where it would work well to double a known fact? Now, all of a sudden, the student has to do a lot of reflecting, a lot of thinking, and come up with some more examples. So that's kind of that reflection side of it, okay? So I want you to spend a little more time delving into these types of questions. And this is the way we're going to do it. So again, I'd like 2 small groups per table, and to identify a group leader, and it can be someone different this time, because you actually are going to be doing a card sort activity. So you don't need to take them out of the envelope yet, I'll give you directions, but decide who your leader is. So the leader can either grab the envelope, or the leader can assign someone to the envelope. But this is the first set of directions, is I want you to find the blue cards only, and take the blue cards, make some room, and lay them out, because those are your 4 categories. So if you need to clean some room, or if you want to work on the floor, whatever works. This is how I'd like you to proceed. So I'm very purposeful in my directions here. And there's a couple steps, so listen to all the directions before you commence. I'd like you to deal the cards out in just a minute, like 30 seconds. To deal them out so like there's like 2 to 3 per person. That will allow each individual person to study their questions and to think about where they might go. But then I would like you to take turns. So person 1 would read their question to the group, suggest a category and a reason for the category, and then you can work together as a group to actually decide on its placement. So I think some of these might be straightforward, but I also think some of them might lead to some debate or discussion. All right? We're going to deal them out, give each person a chance to study them, and then just kind of take turns figuring out where you think they best fit. And probably like 5 minutes, and I'll kind of check in and see where we're at. So go ahead. I'll kind of wrap this up, and then we'll take an official break, and then we'll come back after that. So Steve and I were just having a side conversation, and I know this happened at a lot of groups as well, is that, these questions were drawn from Ms. Bouchard's and other teachers' classrooms that had used the Caterpillar case, and I pulled them out of context. You don't know if they were asking this question of an individual student, of a whole class, of a small group. So some of these questions, it was hard to kind of place them in thinking about what category they might go in. And a couple groups started saying, well, if this was the context, it would maybe be probing. If this was the context, maybe I might just be gathering information. And in fact, some of those questions kind of double barrel. You can get a couple things out of them. So in thinking about the placement, this was a group over here talking about, we can kind of see which of those questions that we're kind of assessing to gather some information that I might start with, but then those questions that I want to push that thinking into the mathematics, the reflection, and the justification. So the specific category isn't as important as us thinking about which ones will be assessing kind of that knowledge, and then what questions might I use to kind of push students thinking a little bit further. But I did have a couple examples up here, and you might debate with me over break. But I think the first one, just show me how you did it, is kind of a gathering information. It's kind of that procedure, right? I see you wrote 10 plus 5 in your paper. Where did that 10 come from? That was like from Cole's work. So to me, that was probing thinking because I see this on one kid's paper. But then again, maybe I'm pushing for the math. Maybe I really want to have a conversation about the mathematics there. So I could see a couple different categories. What number sentence could you write about your picture? Well, this is first grade, so I'm thinking they probably don't have a number sentence, and I want that. So I want that mathematical knowledge to come out. The justification, this was Also with Cole's paper, you know, why did you put those pieces of fruit together? I could almost see that as probing his thinking, but then also trying to get him to reflect and justify that he was looking for those number of pairs and things that went together well. This one in particular, do you agree or disagree with Annie? How many of you kind of thought, oh, that's like a talk move? Let's see how familiar people are here with kind of thinking about talk moves. So in the Taking Action book, we talked some about, there's just kind of these other category of questions that we really want to engage students with the reasoning of each other. So you saw that in the case and in some of these questions. Oh, what do you think of this, of each other's responses? So sometimes people call these talk moves, discourse moves, questions that kind of engage students with the reasoning of each other. And sometimes I think we really ask a question just to kind of engage or check in or manage. But I think the underlying purpose of that one really was more of a reflect and justify what people had done. So again, we can debate and discuss what they're for, but at least we're starting to think, I want to engage students with each other's thinking, and I want to think about advancing their knowledge. Okay, so we are going to, checking my slides here. We are going to go to break, and when we come back from break, we're actually going to look at some discussion excerpts from Ms. Bouchard's classroom. So we thought a little bit about questions, about the different types of questions, and I gave you an opportunity to kind of do some sorting, but that was really a vehicle for your conversation about questioning and about the types of questions we may be posing in our classrooms. We're going to look at a couple excerpts now, one from Ms. Bouchard's classroom and then compare it to one from a different teacher's classroom. And thinking about now a bit more of those questions in context. I mean, it's still very short, but thinking a little bit more about using those questions in the whole class discussion. So if you find your handout, pages 11 and 12. Okay. And then the directions for this part. I'd like you to read through those 2 pages and then just individually label each question. Do you think that's a gather, a probe, making math visible, reflect? I even added a 5th category. Maybe you think it's engage, or maybe you think it's engage and probe. Maybe you think it's number 3 and number 4. And then I wrote 6 as other. Maybe there's a management question in there that doesn't really pertain to mathematics, you can see. So read the 2 pages. And then just turn to your small group and have a short conversation about how you categorize the questions from that transcript. And we'll give you a couple minutes maybe to read and then a minute to kind of debate and discuss. So maybe about 3 minutes as a total group. Go ahead. I didn't ask you to look for, but I suspect you started noticing that interaction of Ms. Bouchard and her students. Thinking about how she asked a question, kind of perhaps listened, asked another question and built on that. So we're also going to start thinking about this interaction pattern that was occurring in Ms. Bouchard's classroom. Kind of keep that in the back of your head for just a little bit. So if we look at the specific questions in that first segment, this is how I would classify them, but we might debate. But I think we're probably in the same ballpark. That line 1, she was really trying to kind of probe the thinking a little bit. Where did you get that answer, right? Line 3, Rosa, can you say back what Cole did? She really was engaging Rosa and the whole class in Cole's thinking, but also kind of like, Rosa, do you understand what he did? Kind of probing a little bit. And then at line 5, can anyone else say back? I guess I'd call that engage. We're not really at the mathematics yet. That was really like, okay, can anybody else say back? So that's one of those talk move kind of things. And that segment was earlier in that class discussion. I think a lot more of those questions were kind of gathering some information, or particularly probing kids' thinking. And then if we go to, backwards here. There we go. I think I have an extra slide in here. I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't look right. So the other one in that first segment was that line 8, and I think you have a typo, it says Sammy, right, rather than Seggy. That one had a little different flavor to it. It was more about, wow, what do you notice? It's the ones, just go on the end. What do you mean by that? Dad started to think about what's the mathematics that is going on here, some ideas about place value. So probing, starting to kind of think more about the math, but that second segment had a little different flavor. It was much more pushing towards a discussion of the mathematical ideas. So in the second segment, line 11, they both got 15 pieces of fruit, but they wrote and solved different equations. Really? Does that work? Now remember, this is first graders. Sometimes they think we all should have the same equation. Well, actually, fifth graders think that too, but that it's okay to have different equations and different things. But starting to push towards that math a little bit more, getting the kids to reflect and justify and why that's okay and why that works. Line 16, I classified that as kind of a making the math visible, because I knew it was from the whole class discussion, where it's like, wow, Cole wrote 10 plus 5, what was it? Evan wrote 6 plus 9, and is that okay? So that was about starting to have an idea about equivalence, talking about equivalence, or talking about how you can compose and decompose numbers, okay? And line 22 was clearly equivalence. The teacher said, well, let's just see. I'm going to take a leap here. I'm going to write this big equation on the board, and is it okay to write those two equations with the equal sign in the middle? And that opens up really a lot of mathematical discussion, as well as reflection and justification on the part of the students. So the second segment was kind of more about the mathematics, reflection, and justification. So if we go back to the 4 types of questions, I tend to think of those first 2 as really assessing. I, as a teacher, am trying to figure out what is it my students are thinking. Okay, where are they at right now? And then the other 2, I tend to categorize those more as advancing questions. It's not set in stone 100%, but those types of questions, I want to take the thinking and move it further. I want the whole class to discuss more of the math ideas. I want them to think about that validity or that convince me type way of thinking. So that's really kind of pushing the conversation further. If you want to jump ahead in your handout, page 18, I thought may perhaps fit better in this conversation. And this is also from the work of Peg Smith, that she would say assessing questions are really about providing information to the teacher. Okay? So when I ask an assessing question, it's not necessarily to the benefit of the student, but it might be. As Steve said earlier, maybe they had a wrong answer, and by probing their thinking, they realize that, oh, wait a minute, something's not right anymore. But in general, a lot of assessing questions are kind of giving information to the teacher about what the student is currently understanding. And those assessing questions are often based really closely on what you see on that paper. I see a 10, where'd that come from? I see 10 plus 5, where'd that come from? And it's kind of to clarify those aspects of the student work and what the student is thinking. Whereas advancing questions really are prompting the student to move further. To think about perhaps an idea they hadn't considered before, like the meaning of the equal sign. Wow, kids hadn't thought about that. And now I, as a teacher, am asking that question. So advancing questions then prompt the learning to go further. Using that student work as a basis for moving students towards that learning goal or further along on a learning trajectory. If we think, oh, these 3 kids, they've kind of met my lesson goal, but I want to move them further. Or it's pressing students to extend it to a new situation. So this is from Peg. She would say, if kids are working in small groups, you kind of ask the question and you stay to hear the answer. Or if it's a whole class discussion, you listen intently to what the student is saying. But if it's an advancing question and kids are working in small groups, those are the ones where you kind of ask it and then you say, I'll be back in a minute and see what you think. All right? Or you walk away and they say, why did you leave me? And you're like, just think about it and I'll come back and check on you. So she would say those are walk away questions. And And I think if it's a whole class discussion, that's why I put the word pauses in parentheses, because that's when you have that really long wait time. And wait and give kids a chance to think about it. Or what works great there is, why don't you turn and talk to a neighbor about that? Okay, so if you want to ask an advancing and a whole group, just turn and talk for a couple minutes and then come back. All right? So you kind of looked at questions that came from the case in the classroom, but I want you to actually get a little opportunity to practice writing these questions. Okay? So that's what we're going to do for maybe the next 5 minutes. Is I want you to focus on the advancing questions, because those are the ones we tend not to ask as much or are harder to ask. So I have 2 pieces of student work, so this is in your handout, page 13. You have Damien's work, which is quite interesting, and then you have Kayla's work. So I'd like you to work with a partner, 2 or 3s, and craft 1 to 2 questions of each type. You know, what's a question you would ask this student or the class to make the math visible for discussion? And then what would be a question you would ask, and you can decide whether you're asking an individual student, maybe as you walk by your desk or his desk, or maybe it's a whole class discussion. What question might you ask the class about Kayla's work or about Damien's to encourage reflection and justification? Now, in posing these questions, we need to have our learning goals in mind, because the questions are trying to advance students toward that learning goal. So I'm going to put the goals up here. These are from earlier. They're also in the case, lines 10 to 12, but I have phrased a little differently. So this is your direction, 1 to 2 questions of each type on page 13, and think about questions that move kids towards those learning goals. So maybe take like 3 minutes, 4 minutes to kind of work in pairs on those questions. Okay, go ahead. Sometimes it's very interesting in thinking about posing questions for first grade work and thinking about making that math come out. You know, making connections back to the story, making connections to the equation, having some conversation and reflection. And a couple groups we talked about, well, what if you did a whole class discussion and even put both pieces of work out and had your students talk about similarities and differences between them. That's always a way to kind of create some of that reflection. And I was even thinking the questions, why not put them both up and say, well, what do you notice and what are you wondering about? Wouldn't that be an interesting whole class conversation? To have the kids start to pose those questions, what are you noticing and what are you wondering? So I asked you to keep in the back of your head kind of the interaction pattern that's going on with Ms. Bouchard's questioning. So that's where we're going to kind of move to next. And I think the best way to kind of illustrate this pattern of questioning is by looking at another case and then comparing the two. So we're going to look at Ms. Chong's classroom. And this is pages 15 to 16. So and this is 2 pieces of student work from Ms. Chong's classroom, Gabe and another student. Fascinating work, especially Gabe's. And these 2 teachers are in the same school. Typical scenario, right? The caterpillar, yeah, let's make that into a math lesson. Let's have the kids, use blocks and let's make sure they all draw pictures, right? So you teachers were co-planning, kind of came up with the same format for how to present the task and engage students in the task. but they really didn't talk about, in retrospect, about how to facilitate a whole class discussion of that work. So Ms. Chong's classroom conversation was actually a little different than Ms. Bouchard's. So what I'd like you to do now is to read Ms. Bouchard, or not Ms.